All right, thank you. Without further delay, it's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Vint Cerf has served as Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google since October 2005. Cerf is the former Senior Vice President of Technology Strategy for MCI. Widely known as one of the fathers of the Internet, Cerf is the co-designer of the TCP/IP protocols and the architecture of the Internet. He performed this work during his tenure with the U.S. Department of Defense's Advanced Research Projects Agency. Cerf has acquired numerous accolades over the years. In '94, he was listed in People magazine's 25 Most Intriguing People. In '97, he received the U.S. National Medal of Technology by President Clinton. 2004, the ACM Turing Award. In 2005, the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bush. In 2013, he was appointed by President Obama to serve on the National Science Board. Dr. Vint Cerf has either started, chairs, or is currently a fellow at virtually every reputable internet technology-related association on the planet. If you're looking for a conversation starter, ask him about Leonard Nimoy, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and what it's like to be married before the internet existed. Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great privilege I ask you please to join me in welcoming the President of the Association for Computing Machinery, Dr. Vint Cerf.
Well, thank you. Welcome to the Google DC Daycare Center. I hope you noticed all the primary colors and everything else. It's really a pleasure to be able to use this facility for meetings like this. So I'm very pleased that the ACM chapter came to us and asked if it was possible. And I certainly appreciate Internet Society's streaming of this activity. This is a special kind of event for me in a way because three of the organizations that I care a great deal about are represented here. ISOC, where I served as the first president, ACM, where I serve as current president, and Google, where I serve as one of the vice presidents. So it means a lot to me to see all three of these organizations collaborating together on tonight's event. I thought I would mention one thing before I get into my formal presentation. The 1994 People magazine thing was a bit of a surprise. I mean, I don't quite know how they even figured out who the heck I was because internet was not terribly, widely known to the general public. It was just as the World Wide Web is starting to show up. But the irony of all this is that my wife, who lost her hearing when she was 3, got 2 cochlear implants, one in '96 and one in 2006, 10 years later. Her story is so dramatic and wonderfully compelling that they sent a photo team out for 3 days tracking her. She got 6 pages in People magazine in 1998, and that's always been a source of, sort of tension in the household. I've never been able to get back in again. The second thing I want to do mention is that you'll be pleased, I hope, to know that Internet and the World Wide Web have been recognized by an extraordinary source as a major engineering achievement. This is, we think of the ACM Turing Award as being the Nobel Prize of Computer Science, but there isn't anything for engineering. Nobel Prizes don't even go close to that. There is a Queen Elizabeth Prize for engineering now. It was established last year. It's awarded every 2 years to up to 5 people, originally up to 3, but now it's up to 5. It's a £1 million prize. That's about $1.5 million. Bob Kahn and I, and Tim Berners-Lee, Mark Andreessen, and Louis Pouzin all were announced as winners of the first QE2 engineering prize. And what is very ironic is that my wife and I are moving to London for 6 months for some work for Google. And less than a week after we arrive in London, we will have lunch with the Lord Mayor of London. We will go on a Thames boat ride with the Prime Minister. Then we will go to Buckingham Palace, where we will meet Queen Elizabeth, and she will hand each of us a check for £200,000. After that, it's all downhill, right? So it's a remarkable welcome to. So I thought tonight, what I thought I would do is just give you a sense for the current state of the internet, which most of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with. Some of the trends that we can already see are happening to it. Some of the implications of those trends, and then some of the problem spaces that we all should have not only an interest in, but feel a responsibility for pursuing. But let's start just with some simple statistics. These data are rather out of date, and the organizations that had been producing them have not, at least to my knowledge, produced anything more recent, although the last time I looked was a couple of weeks ago, so that I could be wrong about that. But the 900 million devices that are visible on the net with domain names and, generally speaking, fixed IP addresses are the servers that are on the system. They don't count the laptops and desktops and other things that are episodically connected. If you add all of those, then you're getting close to the 2.5, 3 billion devices, although there isn't any way for us to actually know that for sure. There's no central registry for any of that. And in terms of the number of users, in mid-year last year it was 2.4 billion. My guess is it would be easy to argue that there are 3 billion users now online. It's a little hard to tell because the 6.5 billion mobiles that are out there, some fraction, maybe on the order of 20% today and probably 50 to 100% years from now, will have smartphone capability, and they'll be able to reach the internet too. And so a lot of people are getting onto the internet with their first experience from a mobile, and for many of them it may stay that way. Although as time goes on, as costs come down, as new technologies arise, more and more people will have multiple devices they can use to interact with the network. So one meme that I'd like to leave you with tonight is that I believe that our early experience of interacting with the net one device at a time will change over time, and that we will be using multiple devices concurrently to make use of the net. I'm wearing Google Glass today. Google Glass is connected to the internet. I turned off the display to keep from being distracted, but if I tap it on the side, it says it's waiting for me to say something. So I'll say, okay, Glass, take a picture. It just took a picture of this group of people here. This is a voice-activated device. I'm sure many of you have read about it. We expect to have we have 2,000 of them out in use today. We're ramping up to 10,000 by the end of the year, and then we go into production in 2014. They're not being sold directly. People have to apply, and they have to offer a description of what it is they propose to do. What we're interested in doing is getting these in the hands of people who will actually invent some interesting applications. We still ask them to pay for these, $1,500 each today. I have no clue what it's going to look like in 2014, but one hopes that as the quantities increase, the price could potentially come down. So these are, yet again, another kind of device connected to the net. And one theme in tonight's discussion is the increasing number of and variety of devices that are part of the internet environment. The other interesting statistic, again, it's from mid-year last year, is where the people are who are using the net. 10 years ago, North America was absolutely the largest number of users and the highest penetration of internet. It's still the highest penetration at slightly under 80%, but Asia has the absolute largest number of users, and China has the largest number of users in any one country. They have 500 million people, 500 million people are online in China today. That's still only on the order of maybe 40% of the population. So you can imagine what that will look like when we get to 80% or so. There will be more than 1 billion people online there in China. So it's interesting, we hear all these stories about Chinese attacks on the net and so on, which are presumably true. But at the same time, it's fair to note that the country is making a huge investment in building internet infrastructure. So one interesting question from the sociological point of view is what happens when they have this enormous fraction of the population all online, all able to use the system, able to exchange information with each other? How does that change the regime's view? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think we're watching a very, very interesting sociological experiment with technology taking place before our eyes. And so as this decade unfolds, I think this is going to be among the more interesting effects to observe. Now, Europe is the next largest in absolute number of users, although you'll notice the penetration rate is below North America. But I've given up making any predictions about Europe because they keep adding countries. So the definition of Europe is changing, and I don't know what it looks like 10 years from now. And the others, I won't go through all of them, but you can see that in Africa, we are still only modestly penetrated. This number is misleading, though, because I think that we have seen a very rapid growth of mobiles in Africa. I don't know what fraction of them are internet capable, probably some fraction, 20% or 30% or something. And what we're seeing is individuals or small families who are willing to pay to get onto the network, or at least to get a mobile, which is a significant fraction of their monthly income. And yet they do this because of the value to them. And so when people make up stories about what will people do with mobile phones in Africa, and they have things like getting prices in the city so that you can figure out where to sell your crops best, the honest fact is that they're just like we are. They use social networking. They do all the other things we do, although the data rates that they have available are more limited, and so some things they don't try, like streaming video, until the data rates are adequate. But their use is not terribly different than ours, except for whatever limitations there are on the local conditions. Well, let's look now at the current internet and see what's happening to it. Everybody in this room is well aware that we ran out of IP version 4 address space in February of 2011. And that was sort of, I don't know that it was an embarrassment for Bob Kahn and me, but it was sort of an interesting surprise. When we were first doing the design in 1973, now 40 years ago, and the question came up, how many addresses should we have on this experimental internet? We didn't know the answer to that. So we said, well, let's see, how many computers will there be, per country? And at the time we were doing this, the machines we were using were big time-sharing machines. So we thought, well, there couldn't be too many of those. They take up a lot of room and they're expensive. But we said, let's, be crazy about it. We allocated 24 bits of address space for the machine, 16 million, what we thought of as mainframes per country. And we thought, boy, that's overkill, right? Then we said, how many countries are there? We didn't know, and there wasn't any Google to look it up. So we guessed it's 128 because that was a power of 2. So, and then we said, well, how many networks will there be per country? And we thought, well, we just built the ARPANET, and it wasn't exactly inexpensive to do that. So maybe there'll be 2 per country, as for competition. So we said 128 times 2 is 256. That's 8 bits plus 24, 32 bits. And we actually debated later in 1977, just as the internet protocols were being standardized, whether we should expand the address space. One group wanted variable length addresses, and the programmers hated that idea because you waste computer cycles finding the fields in the packet because of the variable length, so we didn't do that. Then somebody said, how about 128-bit address space? And at the time, we were running a 50 kilobit backbone. And frankly, an awful lot of the exchanges were full duplex interactions, character by character echoplex. And you can imagine the overhead for one character going back and forth with 256 bits of source and destination address. And that didn't pass the red face test, so we didn't do that either. Then we thought 32 bits would be enough. Well, we all got scared in the mid-1990s and started work on what was going to be called IPNG for next generation. And eventually that produced the IPv6 address space Bob Hindon and others had developed with 128 bits of addresses. So in a very funny way, everyone has been using the experimental internet until now, and the production version has now been finally officially released on June 6, 2012. I have a favor to ask of every one of you. If you will go to whichever ISP supplies you with internet address space and ask them, what is your IPv6 plan? When can I get IPv6? This is important because it's been very, very slow in terms of penetration, mostly because the ISPs haven't bothered to turn it on. A lot of their software is already capable. The routers have it. The edge devices have IPv6, but the ISPs aren't turning it on, and they're saying, disingenuous, like, nobody's asking for it. Well, of course they're not asking for it. Ordinary users don't even know what IPv4 or IPv6 is, and they shouldn't have to. But you do, and so if you will help us embarrass them or force them into admitting people are asking for it, it would be a big help. So thank you for that. Now, I was trying to explain what the implications of 128-bit addresses are. I remember saying one time that meant every electron in the universe could have its own web page, until somebody from Caltech wrote a note saying, dear Dr. Cerf, you jerk, there's 10 to the 88th electrons in the universe and you're off by 50 orders of magnitude. So I don't say that anymore. The other thing that's happening is that domain names which have been written in Latin characters are now can be written in non-Latin characters using the Unicode character set, which accommodates 100,000 or more characters. That same Unicode set is used in HTML and XML for the web, so that makes the web and the domain name system much more compatible. And ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, has initiated a program of expansion of the generic top-level domains. Over 2,000 applications were received for these new domains. Many of them were in conflict because people picked the same ones, but certainly on the order of 1,500 of them are unique. And the question now is which ones will actually become registered as top-level domains, and that process is still unfolding. So this is a major expansion of the namespace. Now, we all understand that the domain name system has a number of vulnerabilities, one of which is poisoning of the name server cache. And so in order to get rid of or to detect and inhibit the effects of that kind of poisoning, the domain name system security architecture is being deployed now. Basically, it's just digitally signing of the binding between the domain name and an IP address. So when you do a lookup to translate a domain name into an IP address, you can ask for a signed response. If you get a correct response back whose checksum, encrypted checksum matches what you expect, then at least you have some confidence in the integrity of the binding. Someone hasn't gone in, modified that binding in order to vector you to the wrong place because they don't have the private key that would have been used to sign that particular binding. So that's being deployed now. The entire root zone is signed, and a number of the second level or the top level domains are signed, and some of the second level domains are signed as well. A similar idea has come up with regard to the routing system. Now, remember that this whole thing was developed at a time when it was mostly geeks who were doing the work, and they trusted each other. Now we're in an environment where you can't do that anymore, so we have to retrofit mechanisms that will deal with untrustable components. In the case of the routing system, basically, in order to become part of the net, you just announce that you're responsible for a particular chunk of the address space. I'm autonomous system number 4, and my IP address space is this. And that propagates around through the routing system. The problem is you can lie. And when you lie about this, then you hijack somebody's address space. In order to defend against that, it has been proposed, but not yet implemented, that we build a similar kind of digital binding, digitally signed binding between the autonomous system number and the IP address space which it is responsible for, so that when you're doing routing updates, you can actually check to see whether the party who is announcing the space actually has the authority to do that. There's some complexity to this because not all routing announcements come from the edge. They get propagated through the net, so some of the announcements are coming from the middle, and so you have to be able to verify that the whole chain of announcement is actually valid. And so it makes it somewhat more complicated, which is why it hasn't been deployed yet, but it's in the process of being developed. Now, I'm going to talk more about sensor networks, the smart grid program, and mobile devices. So this is just a reminder that, again, in our internet environment, these three things are rapidly filling up the system. Now, we all, I'm sure, recognize that devices are showing up on the net that I certainly hadn't anticipated. I used to actually have, this is an older slide, I now have a picture of Larry Page wearing Google Glass as another internet-enabled device. But I can remember being very surprised when somebody came in and said to me that they had just found an internet-enabled picture frame. And I couldn't imagine, what would that mean? All I could think of was, it sounds as useless as an electric fork, bonk. But in fact, it's obviously very useful, and many of us have these now. We have mobiles, we upload our pictures to a website, the pictures are downloaded into the internet-enabled picture frame, and we have an opportunity to watch what's going on in the family. So it's kind of a crude form of Google Plus or Facebook in a way, and it's just personal, and it's at home, and it's actually rather nice for the grandparents because you can upload pictures of the grandchildren, and nieces and nephews, and see what they're doing. Now, the way this works, is it downloads, the frame downloads images from some website. So now security is an issue because if the website gets hacked, the grandparents may see pictures of what they hope is not the grandchildren. So now we have to worry about security at home as well as at work. There are things that look like telephones that are really voice over IP devices. The guy in the middle has built an internet-enabled surfboard. And I don't know him, but I have an image of him sitting on the water waiting for the next wave, thinking, if I had a laptop in my surfboard, I could be surfing the internet while I'm waiting for the next wave. So he puts a laptop in the surfboard and then built a Wi-Fi service back on the rescue shack on the beach. Now he sells this as a product. So if you want to go surf the net while you're out on the water, this is for you. I used to tell jokes that every light bulb in the world will someday have an IP address, and I can't tell jokes about that anymore because somebody sent me an IPv6 radio-enabled LED light bulb, and it works. I have an IPv6 network running in the house, and you can turn the lights off and on with that little gadget. Now, the interesting thing is that this, not only can you turn it off and on, you can tell whether it's broken or not, you can interrogate it and find out. So these sorts of things are becoming reality. And so if you have only imagined that this was science fiction and speculation, it is not. We are, in fact, I just realized that some people wonder they can't see me because I'm hiding behind a thing. Is that right? Okay, I can do this. So this is my sensor net at home. This is an IPv6 radio net. It's a commercial product, so it's not me in the garage, with a soldering gun. The company that makes these is Archrock, which was acquired by Cisco Systems a couple of years ago. The boxes are about the size of a mobile. They run on 2 AA batteries. They are sampling the light level, the humidity, and the temperature in each room in the house every 5 minutes. And that data is propagated through this network of sensors. So the sensors are actually store and forward relays. They're running 6LoWPAN and an IPv6 on top of that. And so the data is accumulated in a server that I have in a rack down in the basement. So, only a geek would do this, right? But my thought was that at the end of the year, I will have very good information about how well the heating and ventilation and air conditioning has actually worked. Instead of anecdotal information, I have real engineering data. So as an engineer, I like that. Now, one room in the house is the wine cellar. And so that one is alarmed. And if the temperature goes above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, I get an SMS on my mobile telling me that the wine is warming up. I remember going into Argonne National Laboratory for a 3-day visit. And just as I was walking into the building, the mobile goes off. It's the wine cellar calling. That you've just broken through the 60-degree Fahrenheit barrier. No one was home at the time. And so every 5 minutes for the next 3 days, I kept getting this little message saying your wine is warming up. So I called the Archrock guys and they said, do you have remote actuators? And they said yes. And they said, do they have strong authentication on them? Because I have a 15-year-old next door and I don't want him messing with my wine cellar. And they said yes. So that's a weekend project to install. Then I got to thinking, I could probably tell if somebody has gotten into the wine cellar while I'm away because I can see if the lights have gone off and on, but I don't know what they did in there. So I thought, okay, solution to this is to put RFID chips on each bottle. And then I can do an instantaneous inventory to see if any wine has left the cellar without my permission. And I was describing this brilliant design to one of my engineer friends, and he told me there was a bug. I said, what do you mean there's a bug? And he said, well, you could go into the wine cellar and drink the wine and leave the bottle. So now we have to put sensors in the cork. And as long as we're going to do that, we might as well sample testers to find out whether the wine is ready to drink. So before you open the bottle, you interrogate the cork. And if that's the bottle that got to 80 degrees or something, that's the one they give to Mike Nelson because he doesn't know the difference. So, now, actually, this sort of thing is going to be very common, not necessarily the wine cellar part. Although, in fact, I had someone come out with a prototype RFID gun and a bunch of RFID tags, and we actually wandered around the wine cellar and we picked up every single bottle. So this is actually doable. It's not a crazy idea. The thing is that we will have sensor networks that will use them for environmental control, we'll use them for security, we'll use them for a variety of things to allow a residence or a business or a manufacturing facility to be managed and controlled and monitored. So these things will be very much a part of the internet environment over time. Now, there's an interesting question, and I'm going to use the sensor network as a tool for walking us through a bunch of questions. Now, the questions are very specific to the notion of sensor network architecture and large numbers of devices that have to be configured and access controlled. But I want you, as we go through this particular discussion, I want you to be thinking generally about internet-enabled appliances of all kinds, having to be managed and controlled, and wanting them to be isolated from parties who might want to use them for nefarious purposes. I mean, the thing that we don't want is a big headline that says that there was a distributed denial of service attack against Bank of America by every refrigerator in America. So we need to be able to think our way through how you will configure, install, operate, protect, and also move from one place to another. So imagine that you take your appliances with you. They have IP addresses in them. Maybe they will get new IP addresses when they are installed in a new residence. How do we do all of that without expecting every single homeowner to become an expert in configuring IP devices? They shouldn't have to do that. They shouldn't have to know anything about that. And so there are a whole series of design and operational questions. Should there be a single controller for all of the devices? Should there be a controller for each class of device? How should we get each device to connect up with the appropriate controller? What if you're in an apartment building and your controller detects devices that are in the neighboring apartment? This is sort of like the problem we have with an electric blanket where the two parties have the controls switched. One is turning it up to get warmer and the other is turning it down to get cooler, and of course they're cross-connected. So there are these questions that are actually pretty hard. And I think some of us are going to have to figure out what's the right way to do it. Problem, should they all be wireless? Well, depending on where they are installed, you may or may not have good radio connectivity even just inside the house. So some of them might have to be wired, some might be wireless, some might use different frequencies. None of this is easy, and every device that is sold to be part of one of these sensor environments is going to have to be adaptable to different conditions depending on what is found in the place where they're installed. On the factory floor, there are similar kinds of scaling questions that occur, and once again, very important to make sure that these are controlled only by parties that have the authority to do that. You don't want some random person halfway around the world to turn on a manufacturing device and possibly harm one of the workers. The other question is whether the devices interact with each other or whether they only interact with an edge device. And here we get into the interesting example of the Archrock system where the devices are relays for each other. In addition to providing sensed data, not censored data, and then providing it to some accumulator, but they also are part of a network which is self-adapting to local radio conditions. So the questions are almost endless. There's some more here. How do you decide what IP addresses I should have? Do you generate these using IPv6 presumably, because v4 won't be useful? But there is a question about what the prefix should be. What should the addresses be? How are they assigned? Are they remembered? What about auto discovery? How do I discover other devices that are part of the system? Some of you will know a little bit about how the Bluetooth system works. If you've used it, you know that when two devices are in close enough proximity, one of them will present a number which you enter into the other one in order to confirm that you want the two devices to be connected. Now, the question is whether every device in this environment has a display capability or not. And if it doesn't, we start thinking about, well, how do I manage these things? And it could be that your mobile becomes the device that's used not only to control them, but also to configure them. And so the possibilities here are fairly complex, and we're going to have to figure out how to make that work. What about web tools? I mean, it's very attractive to be able to go to a website and say, I would like to use a web page to manage my devices. And if we standardize things properly, then third parties will be able to offer service to manage your systems for you. I mean, think about entertainment. I don't know about you, but I have lots of boxes at home that have infrared controllers for them. And usually I fumble around for a while trying to figure out which controller is the right one for which box. And when I finally get that right, that's the controller with the dead battery. So if we put all of them up on the local network and we use the mobile, which is also on the local net, as the controller, or maybe it's a tablet that can be a controller, then that means third parties can intervene if they wish, if you allow them to be the manager of the devices. And all you do is go to the website and say, I want these songs and movies. Please populate all the various devices on which this entertainment content is of interest to me. So it's just incredibly rich territory. What about state information? If you have things that are gathering data about the temperature, humidity, light levels, in my case, or other things about the house, you may be able to infer whether anybody's at home, how many people are at home, when are they active and when are they not active. Depending on what information is available, that could pose a security hazard, especially if they can figure out that nobody's home. So again, this is a question of what information should be available, who should have access to it, how do you control that? So this just goes, it's a long, long list of things that we're going to have to cope with. Here's another interesting thing. The set-top boxes, typically the cable provider configures these things for you, and it operates the controller for you, and it offers web accesses to control the system. And the set-top boxes, at least some of them now, can interact with each other like sharing a DVR. So that's a common example, but one thing, what happens if we transform these into devices that are IPv6 enabled, and they have the ability to reach out and use the internet in addition to everything else? Now they become devices that can be streaming video from other sources than the cable television company, and that, interestingly enough, creates a conflict, right? Because the cable TV guy is supplying you with broadband access to the internet, discovers that you're using the broadband internet to get access to somebody else's video, which messes up their business model, which leads to a possible desire to prevent you from getting video from anybody but them. That gets into net neutrality debates and everything else. So very quickly, as we pursue these technical problems, we also uncover and unearth various policy issues that have to be resolved. And I've already talked about the arch rock thing. So, the other big question is diversity and uniformity. Uniformity is really helpful because it allows you to achieve interoperability. Diversity is important because you want to be able to try new things, and figuring out how to cope with both of those at the same time is a big challenge. The Smart Grid is a program that was started by the Department of Commerce and the Department of Energy about 4 years ago. And their initial focus was to create a smart grid interoperability panel to encourage standards for the devices that are part of the smart grid, so they could be managed, so they could respond, for example, to advice saying that the power grid was reaching a peak load and would you please not heat the water or run the air conditioner for a while. This is important because the ability to control load lets you not build capacity, excess capacity that's only used a small percentage of the time. And so that's an important capability, this ability to say, please don't use electricity now. But you also have the opportunity to get a report back, like which devices were used during the course of the month and how long and when. That would tell you something about why your electric bill is what it is. And that feedback loop is what helps us decide whether we should change our lifestyle, possibly for economic reasons, or maybe we just care about the environment. We want to change our footprint of use of electricity, for example. So again, there are a whole series of issues associated with the Smart Grid program that are not unlike the ones with the sensor networks, except one thing which is really different. Up until recently, most of the power generated in the United States was centrally generated and distributed over power lines. We're now reaching the point where we are capable of putting generation capability at the edges of the net. And it gets even more dramatic when you go from just photovoltaic and maybe wind power and possibly even geothermal as generators of electricity in your home. Now we get we get electric cars, and they have big batteries. And so now you have the possibility not only of pulling power out of the system to recharge the cars, but pushing power into the system. Now I want you to think about control theory if you took it in school. It gets more complicated if systems can both push and pull electricity at the same time. Now we have the problem that we are independently, every household in the United States is either generating electricity or pulling electricity. How do you balance a system like that? And so if you're interested in some of the thinking about that, look up microgrids, do a Google search on that, because the ideas now are to consider actually distributing electrical power generation farther so that we aren't so dependent on one single central facility in a particular area. And so we might avoid a lot of the meltdowns that people have. This leads me to one other thing about internet and the thing that Mike mentioned earlier about policy. One of the big issues that we have today is that there are countries that see how important the internet is, but they're nervous about it because it has this democratic ability to let people share information. And for some authoritarian regimes, that's a threat. We've seen the outcomes, for example, in Arab Spring. I'd like to emphasize something for you. I mean, some people are pounding their chest saying, look, the internet was part of, or Facebook and others were part of the Arab Spring, and isn't it wonderful? Except the outcomes of revolutions don't always come out the way you would like. And right now we're seeing some pretty difficult problems in Egypt, for example, in Libya, for example, in Syria, for example. Tunisia is of the places where the Arab Spring started. Tunisia is probably the one which has had the most, I don't use the word placid exactly, but it's the most stable regime change. But the others have been very, very difficult. So I want to be careful not to tout the role of the internet in all of this as if it is uniformly positive. You have to be really thoughtful about how you recover from major regime change. But what this has led to is a real debate about what role governments have in the control of the internet. For all of us in the internet world, historically, we've seen this as a very bottom-up thing, where multiple stakeholders are interested in making decisions about policy. They're the ones that are affected by it, whether it's the technical community, the general public, civil society, the governments, the private sector, all have an equal stake in what happens in the policy domain. And yet, many of the intergovernmental institutions, like the International Telecommunications Union, see this as the province of governments to make policy. And this is a place where there is plenty of opportunity for intervention. The World Summit on the Information Society, which began in 2003, began with the premise that there would be an information society, and we were seeing it emerge on its own. What did it mean from the policy point of view? And the first thing that these government officials, remember this was an intergovernmental discussion, the first thing that they asked was, what's an information society? And people said, well, the internet is an example of that. So they said, well, who's in charge of the internet? Nothing could possibly be this big and work if it wasn't centrally managed. And we said, well, nobody, it's a distributed system. And they didn't believe us. So then they discovered ICANN, because ICANN has responsibility for IP address allocations and domain name management. And they decided that ICANN must be in charge of the internet. And then they said, well, who's in charge of ICANN? They decided ICANN had a government contract with the Department of Commerce, so NTIA must be in charge of the internet. And that meant the US is in charge of the internet, and that didn't sit well with some of the countries. So that theme, that the US in charge of the internet, has been a persistent issue since 2003. The Internet Governance Forum was created out of the World Summit on the Information Society as a place where we could talk about issues arising in the internet. It's a very important multi-stakeholder system or function. It doesn't make decisions. This turns out to be really important, because if you make decisions, if you draft communiques or make recommendations, you have to argue with each other, and you end up doing these little wordsmithing things. In the end, what we want is people going away understanding what are the issues facing the internet, how should they be addressed, and by whom, but not by IGF. IGF is there as a way of surfacing the problems and helping people figure out what they should do. Let me skip through all of the international telecom stuff, although some of you who follow the World Conference on Information Technology know that there was a major earthquake. This was intended to revise the international telecom regulations, which hadn't been touched since 1988. And at that point, of course, government officials especially, weren't thinking about internet at all. So they didn't take into account what the internet was like and what it could do, how it could subsume almost all of the earlier telecommunications applications and systems, which it has done. So they tried to revise these things, and the countries that were most interested in finding ways to control the internet wanted to use the international telecom regulation revision as a way of gaining authority over the net. So they tried to put language into the ITRs that spoke of spam, for example, and spoke of security, spoke of viruses and worms and so on. Well, those are applications, that's content. And never in history has the International Telecom Union ever dealt with content. I mean, it was standardizing telephone interaction and originally telegraph interactions, but it was never responsible for content. They didn't control what you could say on the phone. They only tried to make sure you could make a phone call. Well, I think the internet should be the same way, but these guys didn't see that way. The result of the debate was that of the 140 some odd countries that attended, 89 signed the resulting treaty, and 55 walked away, including the United States, which was the right thing to do. So that is the biggest schism in international negotiations regarding telecom that's ever happened in the history of the ITU. I think it's a very important data point, and I think that we should actually kind of take advantage of the fact that there is disagreement in order to force people to face the fact that the internet is different from all of the other telecom systems that we've dealt with in the past. So I want to skip over to privacy and safety. You hear security, security, security is an issue on the internet. It's true. But what I'd like to suggest to you is that word causes people to think too much about national security. They think about nation-state attacks and so on, which happen. Okay, so this is not to argue that they don't. But the general public kind of goes this way at the point where we're talking national security. What they don't fully appreciate is that they are also part of the problem, but it's safety that they care about. They would like to feel like they're safe on the internet, and they don't feel that safe right now because of all the various problems that get reported. So I've been thinking that we should be working out a kind of cyber fire department. The model I have in my head is somebody standing in front of his house. It's burning down, and he's got a garden hose. And he's thinking, I need somebody with a bigger hose and more water in order to put this out. And the first thing that comes to mind is not to call the police department. You call the fire department. So we don't have a cyber fire department. And for a lot of individuals, households, and small businesses and everything else, they don't have the expertise to put out a cyber fire. They don't know what to do about being infected. They don't, even if they know they're infected, they don't know what to do about a cyber attack of one kind or another. I would love to have a kind of cyber fire department that you could call on as a business or even as an individual. But the rules may have to be different from what we do when we actually call the fire department. Your neighbor can call the fire department if he sees your house on fire. The fire department feels free to come in and break the windows and the roof in order to put the fire out because the neighborhood is at risk until the fire is out. But now imagine your competitor calls the cyber fire department and says, you're under attack. Okay, so the cyber fire department comes out, breaks everything down for 3 days trying to figure out what the problem is. Meanwhile, you're out of business and your competitor is smiling. So the rules for being able to engage the fire department may have to be different. They may have to be voluntary, for example. Now, the other thing that's important in this analogy is that the fire department, after they put out the fire, try to figure out why the fire started. And if it was arson, then suddenly the police department or the FBI or others, law enforcement gets involved. You can imagine a similar kind of scenario. Something else happens. The fire departments will come out and inspect your building to see whether or not you meet fire code or not. And we have fire codes for buildings. And you can imagine looking for advice and even some rules for designing systems that are safer than others. Just like we have rules for doing buildings that are safer and have rules for multiple exits and entrances for safety's sake. So I think that we are at a period of time when it's worth actually considering the invention of a cyber fire department. There are 3 other things here that I wanted to mention. I have a few other things to talk about, but I also note that I'm getting pretty close to having bored you for almost an hour. My God, I can't believe that. Here's the problem. Digital signatures are really attractive, right? You can send digitally signed things anywhere. The question is, legally, is a digital signature binding? And it's not 100% clear right now, especially on an international basis, whether or not a contract that's been signed digitally has weight in court. And so there's a missing assessment. Either there is legislation that's required, or there may be international treaties required in order to determine whether or not a digital signature on a contract is binding. We don't have agreements yet on that, but I think it would enhance commerce if we could come to some agreements about that. I'm sure all of you are aware of the current state of debate on intellectual property. On the patent side, software patents have turned out to be a nightmare. And I think all of us recognize why that is. The best example I can give you of why openness is important for creativity and innovation is HTML. When the first browsers were made, even the one that Tim Berners-Lee did, they had the feature that you could actually ask it to show you the HTML source. And you could figure out, how did they do that? And then they copied each other. And it was great because webmasters learned from each other. They developed new ideas. Everybody got to try new things out. And the evolution of the web page was pretty dramatic. over a very short period of time because people could share each other's ideas and use of HTML. And that's just one example of the reason why openness has been so valuable. That's why Google makes open source available for Android and Chrome OS for the same reasons. But right now, there's a lot of tension over that. Now, when it comes to copyright, it's a whole other story. Some of you will remember in the Constitution, the notion of copyright was installed in there for two reasons: to benefit a party who had created a work for a limited period of time. Originally, it was 14 years. And if you were the author of something, you could control who could make copies of it for that period of time. If you were still alive after 14 years, you actually had an option to extend the copyright again by another 14 years. I think you had to make a payment to do that. Well, what has happened and then after that period had expired, the work became part of the public domain. The intent here to benefit the population. And the words are in there exactly that way. Well, what has happened over the course of a couple of hundred years is that the intellectual property community has extended the lifetime of control that the copyright holder has to 75 years after the death of the author. And this feels a little excessive to me because it seems to have left out the idea that things in the public domain would benefit the general public. I think we've gone way too far over. We're seeing similar problems with patents because we have people fighting over patents that are expending billions of dollars on things that probably shouldn't have been patented in the first place. And I think this is largely true of software. So this is a big problem. And some of us in the technical world are going to have to engage with the legal people in order to work through the implications of changing the way these things work. And the final thing I wanted to mention on this slide has to do with the problem that we are increasingly creating digital content. Every day when we use word processing programs or we use spreadsheets or we use presentation software of one kind or another, we create fairly complex digital files. The thing is that the bits in those files are only meaningful if the software that created them is available. And one of the problems that arises is that over time, that software may not be executable on the machines that you have available. And so if you've carefully stored the bits and you've moved them from the 5¼ inch floppy to the 3½ inch thing to the DVDs or CDs and Blu-ray and so on, if you've moved the bits from one medium to another, there's no guarantee that the software that created them will still be running on the machine that you're currently using or the operating system that you're currently using. The little mind experiment I remember was, what happens if it's the year 3000 and you've done a Google search and you turn up a 1997 PowerPoint file? The question, suppose you're running Windows 3000, just for the sake of argument. And the question is, will the Windows 3000 package interpret the 1997 PowerPoint file correctly? And the answer is probably no. And this is not a gratuitous dig at Microsoft. Even if you were using open source mechanisms, it's not 100% clear that the open source programs would continue to be compilable for every machine up until the year 3000. So there's a real challenge there, which is maintaining the ability to interpret the bits. If it's scientific data, it's even worse, because you need to keep track not only of the bits themselves from measurements that have been made, but the calibration of the instruments and the conditions under which the data was collected. We don't have a regime right now that will either assure that we can retain that information or even that we can get access to software when a company goes out of business or when they release a new version and it's not compatible with the previous one. How do we get access to the previous software? There is no current regime which recognizes the importance of retaining access to these digital bits. Some of you probably saw the movie Lincoln, and you remember reading a book called A Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Gooding. One of the interesting things about her book is that she reconstructed the dialogue of the time by going to 100 different libraries and finding the letters that the principals in that story had sent to each other. And she was able to reconstruct dialogue based on that. Imagine that you're in the 22nd century and you're trying to reproduce what life was like in our 21st century. Everything we've done is digital and it's all gone, it's not accessible. They won't know who we were. We will not be good ancestors. We will be invisible ancestors. So if we care about this, we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that problem. Okay, I'm going to, you know what? It's really getting late, isn't it? I really feel compelled to tell you some of this. Is it okay? All right. So the thing that's interesting about the internet is that despite the fact that Bob and I will celebrate the 40th anniversary of the design this year, the first paper was published in May of '74, but the original paper was written in September of '73. And we turned the system on January 1, 1983. So it's been operational for 30 years. In spite of this age, it has evolved pretty dramatically, and there are lots of things that are still going on that could be done. But the OpenFlow idea out of Stanford University and Nick McCune's group is a particularly interesting example. You know, when we built routers, you know, Cisco and others built routers, they used the address bits on the packets to figure out where they should route them. So you look at the destination address, and you look it up in the table, and you squirt it out whichever pipe the table tells you to, the forwarding table tells you to do that. Nick McCune and his guys said, why are we limiting ourselves to the address bits? Why can't we use other bits in the packet to tell us where to route things? What if we didn't look at the address bits at all? We just looked at the content and decided how to route based on that. That has a slightly multicast-like ring to it, doesn't it? Because you can imagine announcing you were interested in this kind of content. And now everybody that said, I'm interested in that kind of content, would get copies of the packets because the routing table would say anybody that said they wanted that content, we would route to. That's multicast. So what they have done basically is open up the notion of routing to a much broader range of possibilities. This is really powerful stuff, and I don't have time to go into all the details of it, but Google decided to build our wide area network backbone that connects all of our data centers together using OpenFlow. So over a period of about 18 months where we worked with the OpenFlow team, we actually implemented an OpenFlow routers that we built ourselves, and we put them into operation in the backbone linking all the data centers together. It's given us substantially better performance in terms of utilization of the optical network that links our data centers. So it was a very ambitious thing to do. I didn't have anything to do with it, so I can't take any credit and don't want to. Urs Holzla is our senior VP for infrastructure, and his team just went and did it, and it's really impressive. So this is an example of breaking out of an older paradigm. It will emulate everything that an ordinary router can do because if it just sticks with the address bits. But the fact is, it's like any new technology where it does the previous thing, and then because you're using new technology to do the previous thing, you can do some new stuff that nobody realized you could do. And that's very exciting. We talked about configuration management and the Internet of Things. Here's another problem, certificates and certification. A lot of people thought that issuing certificates would be a great way to do strong authentication, but that assumes you could trust the certificate authorities that issued the certificate in the first place. The problem with the certificate notion is that the issuer of a certificate can have any string they want to associated with the public key. There was no constraint. And so if you, in fact, were able to coerce a certificate authority, bribe a certificate authority, or break into a certificate authority and generate a false certificate with Google or Microsoft or one of the other software providers' name in that certificate, and then somehow issue software associated with that certificate, you could cause people to mistakenly download and install malware. Well, the problem here is that you can't trust every certificate authority. Now you could try to filter that. If you look at your browser and you see how many certificate authorities are trusted, it's silly, and it's wrong. So the other alternative in the IETF right now is to look at the possibility of installing certificates in the domain name system using DNSSEC as the tool for making sure that everything going down to the place where the certificate has been installed has been digitally signed. So there's a chain of trust. On top of that, the certificates are limited to refer to strings that are related to the zone in which that domain name and certificate are installed. So if you're at google.com, the only certificates that I can have in google.com will be second-level domain or third-level domains inside of google.com. Any other attempt to pull a certificate out of that part of the domain name zone would have to be rejected out of hand because the string that was accredited wasn't from that zone. So that's an example of a way of responding to this sort of thing. Let me just mention one other thing, and then I want to give you a quick summary on the interplanetary system. Those of you who study the history of computing may remember Project Mac at MIT back in the 1960s. One of the interesting things they did was to modify a machine. I think it was a GE 635, turned it into a 645 that had 8 rings of protection and memory management. The 8 rings of protection were triggered whenever you executed a sensitive instruction. That instruction trapped down to the kernel software, and it said, who are you, what are you doing here, and what instruction are you trying to execute, and what makes you think you have the authority to do that? And the kernel would decide whether or not you were actually allowed to execute the instruction and place you in the appropriate ring of control. So as you got down to ring 0, you had more and more control over the machine. This is an example of hardware and software working together to reinforce security. We actually have that capability in the x86 chips, but nobody's programming it. And they should be, but they're not. So that's one example of hardware reinforcing security with the software. The same thing has just happened recently with BIOS, with digitally signed BIOS, where you can't execute the bootstrap program that boots in the operating system unless the digital signature on the BIOS code checks out with the hardware. It's another example of getting more reinforcement. Okay, I'm going to skip down to the interplanetary internet. Some of you have heard about this, so it's just an update on the status. When we started, we were interested in providing better networking for exploring Mars. This was in 1998, just after the Pathfinder project landed a small rover on Mars very successfully. The information that was coming back went directly from that little rover all the way back to Earth through the Deep Space Network. And so my colleagues and I at the Jet Propulsion Lab were thinking, what should we be doing that we will need 25 years from now in order to provide better networking for the space-faring nations? And we very quickly concluded we should use rich networking like internet. And then we said, well, maybe we can use TCP/IP. It works on Earth, so maybe it'd work on Mars too. And of course it'll work on Mars, but it doesn't work between the planets because of the variable delay, which could be up to 20 minutes one way, 40 minutes round trip, and also disruption. You know, the planets are rotating. We haven't figured out how to stop that. So if you're talking to something on the surface and the planet rotates, or maybe there's an orbiter, you can't talk to it till it comes back around again. So we end up with this variable delay and disruption environment. TCP is brittle in that regard. So we developed a new suite of protocols we call the bundle protocol. You know, we're engineers. We didn't come up with very good names. If we'd done Kentucky Fried Chicken, we would have called it Hot Dead Birds. You know, we're just not really good at naming. So the bundle protocol is in the interplanetary world what the internet protocol is on planet Earth. It'll run on basically anything that'll move a packet of bits from one place to another. It runs on top of TCP, it runs on top of UDP, it runs on top of IP, it runs on top of point-to-point links. Here's what we did. After we went through 4 iterations of the design of the system, we installed it for experimental purposes. Well, actually, let me go back. There was, as you know, in 2004, rovers that were landed in January, 2 of them, very successfully, Spirit and Opportunity. One of them, I forget which, Spirit, has died. I can remember, one of them is dead and the other one is still producing data. But when they were first landed, they were supposed to transmit data directly back to Earth the way the Pathfinder did. But those radios overheated, and the result is that they needed to reduce the duty cycle to keep it from harming itself or any other equipment. Well, it was originally rated at 28 kilobits a second. And that was, you know, the scientists were not happy about that. When we told them we'd have to reduce the duty cycle, they were even more unhappy about that. And so one of the engineers said, well, there's an X-band radio on the rover and there's an X-band radio on the orbiters, which have been put in place in order to survey the planet to decide where the rover should go. But they'd finished that task, so they were just in orbit and they had available communications, computing, and memory. So the orbiters and the rovers were reprogrammed to take data that it had collected and squirt it up to the orbiter when it got into the right place, and then hold on to the data until it transmitted data back to the deep space net on Earth. And the data rate going on the X-band radio was 128 kilobits a second. In fact, it's been upgraded now to 256. And the orbiters, since they had larger solar arrays and didn't have any problem with even the thin Mars atmosphere, could transmit data back at more than 128 kilobits a second. So all the data that was coming back from Mars was going store and forward, which is packet switching. So that was a demonstration of how well that could work. The Phoenix lander that landed in May of 2008 was in the North Pole. It didn't have a configuration that went straight back to Earth, so they went through the relay again. Then we uploaded the protocols to the Epoxy spacecraft, which is in orbit around the Sun, that had rendezvoused with 2 comets. It was called Deep Impact originally, and then a new mission renamed it Epoxy. So it has the protocols on board. The rovers have the protocols on board. The orbiters have the protocols on board. The International Space Station has the protocols on board. We're operating basically a kind of rudimentary interplanetary network now. And so what's happening is that at NASA, there's efforts to standardize these protocols internationally through the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems. We're hoping that everybody will adopt the protocols, use them in their missions, or even if they don't use them on their missions, at least have them on board. So when those missions are done, we can repurpose those devices as nodes in an interplanetary backbone. So we might actually see something like that over many decades. Now, some people have said, well, why are you doing this? And of course, one answer is to provide rich options for more complex missions with multiple spacecraft in orbit, in tandem flying, in orbit around the sun, for example, or flying out of the solar system, or possibly on the surface. Where, in fact, we did an example of that a couple of months ago. The European Space Agency, in cooperation with the US, did a test from the International Space Station using the interplanetary protocols to control a rover on the ground in Germany. And so what we were demonstrating is what it would be like if you were in orbit around Mars and you needed to control a rover remotely. It was close enough that it was real-time interaction. So the protocols, although they can deal with variable delay, are also perfectly okay, just like UDP, with a low delay environment. So you wonder, well, all right, so that might help build more complex missions. But I have one other reason for doing this. DARPA released a contract last year for $500,000 to a consortium to design a spacecraft that can get to the nearest star in 100 years. That's 4.4 light years away. It's Alpha Centauri. And so I'm lucky to be part of that consortium. And there are three problems. Problem number one is propulsion. It turns out that the current propulsion systems would take about 65,000 years to get from Earth to Alpha Centauri, which is a little long even for a DARPA project. So the question is, how do I get up to about 20% the speed of light? And oh, by the way, we need to slow down before we get to the other end. Otherwise, we'll get one image, and then it's an expensive image. So the idea would be to slow down and go into orbit. So we have to reach a speed of about 20% the speed of light at midpoint, 50 years, and then be able to slow down to get into orbit at the other end. So that's one problem. Navigation is another problem. Imagine, that when we do interplanetary projects now, usually the spacecraft get to a certain point in the mission and you have to do mid-course corrections, and we do that interactively. Not literally real time, but we send the correction information and we get back confirmation about the change in the flight path. Now, imagine that you're doing this with a spacecraft that's a light year away. So it takes a year for the information to get there and another year for you to find out whether or not it worked or not. And this didn't feel like it was real interactive at all. So I got worried about that until somebody pointed out that the proper motion of the stars that are within about 10 light years of our solar system is actually pretty well known, which means that we can do autonomous navigation most likely for that space, because we can use stars that are much farther away as a way of calibrating where we are and then use that to make the mid-course corrections. So that part was easy. Then there's communication. How in the heck do you generate a signal that'll be detectable on Earth from 4 light years away? And also you have to deliver the equipment to 4 light years away, so you have some limitations on mass that you can send. So I've been thinking, well, maybe femtosecond lasers. Imagine you have a 100-watt power supply and you compress a 100-watt signal into 10 to the minus 15 seconds. That should give you a pretty good signal strength. But now, even if it's a laser beam, it's going to beam spread over 4 light year distance. So now you get this very attenuated, high pulse, attenuated about the size of the solar system. So now you know why I need the interplanetary backbone, is so I can build a synthetic aperture receiver to detect the signal coming from Alpha Centauri. Now, one of the physicists said, wait a minute, there's another way to do this. What is that? He said, well, you know that if gravity will bend light. That's how we figured out that Einstein's theory was right. So he said, if you go 550 astronomical units away from the sun, you begin to get to the point where the sun's gravity will form a focal plane. So if we can just get equipment 550 AU out from Earth, then we can use the focal gravitational lens of the sun in order to focus the signal that's coming from Alpha Centauri. So that's sort of the current idea behind building an interstellar system. Intergalactic is somebody else's problem. All right, well, I'm sorry I went on so damn long, but you can tell I'm enthusiastic about this. I'm happy to spend some time on Q&A, but I will forgive you if you all decide to run away. But I thank you in any case for coming to Google this evening.
Mr. Cerf, thank you so much for a great speech. I remember another great speech you gave last year at the Freedom to Connect conference at the AFI. You also talked about cybersecurity then. You said there was a lack of understanding that people were caught up in buzzwords like cybercrime
and cyber warfare and things like that. Those are real. I mean, those problems are real. The problem is that if we confine our discussion to those words, we actually bend our thinking in ways that are not general enough. So where do you want to go with that?
Since you gave that speech March last year, yeah, it was about a year ago now. Do you think government and business have taken a different approach or mentality towards cybersecurity that you've seen?
I have actually had some interactions with the Department of Homeland Security, which is actually doing an experiment with a cyber safety notion. So I don't know how far they've gotten in releasing the functionality to make it available, but my understanding is that they see the need for the ordinary public and the small businesses to have a place to go to get help, because the only help they get today tends to be antivirus software they can download, which does help to some degree, but all of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with day zero attacks, which are increasingly common. And the other thing that I worry about specifically is the response to a cyber attack. If you have an attack which let's take a distributed denial of service attack, if your response is, I'm going to wipe out the disk drives of all the machines that are attacking me, it turns out those machines are probably owned by citizens who don't know their machines are infected. And if you wipe out the disk drives of 1 million people, some of those machines were important for daily operation, and suddenly we have shot ourselves in the foot. So that can't be the right answer. So we have to think our way through a lot more carefully about how do we attribute the source, and what do we do about the case where the actual attacking devices are not under the control, actually, of the users. So there's still a lot of work to be done.
I was saying, I think in the beginning you mentioned the next big thing possibly is people using their devices in unison to do X, Y, and Z, like play music all in the same room, play video, record like surveillance and stuff. Maybe you can share more thoughts about that. I'm working on that myself, so it's cool to hear you say that.
So one of the things that I find interesting, one thing that your question suggests, imagine you're driving in the car and you are asking questions like, how do I get to this destination? The voice message may go to a speech understanding system, but the answer may come back on the navigational display on the car. And here you wound up using two devices at the same time. The way that the navigational system knows what is the address of the navigational display is that the system that's taking your voice is also telling the destination, here are the other devices in the car. Or how about you walk into a hotel room and your mobile is turned on, and the mobile discovers you have a high-resolution display available. Well, instead of showing everything on the tiny little screen on the mobile, now suddenly put it up on the large high-resolution. So these are all the kinds of things that I imagine we could do. Access control is clearly an issue. You don't want to be, well, maybe you do, but the other guy in the room next door doesn't want you looking at what's on his mobile on your high-resolution display. And so it's clear that we have to do something to make sure things are properly controlled. We have a question over here, but I don't know where the microphone just went. Oh, okay.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for your contributions, Mr. Cerf. My question is pertaining TCP, and I've been following the web protocols as they evolved. We're seeing TCP underlying both WebSockets and HTTP 2.0. I'm curious whether a single stream of transport with consistent in-order messaging is still what you feel is the right choice of underlying protocols for being able to communicate on the World Wide Web?
So first of all, the answer is that one of the reasons that the internet is so interesting is you can invent new protocols. And many of them, RTP is one, for example. HTTP is sitting on top of TCP, but others are adjacent to TCP. So to answer your question, no, I don't think that TCP is the only thing that should be used. It's astonishing to me that it has actually serviced us as well as it has when you think about its set of constraints and everything else. But a lot of what happens on the net is that uses TCP does not necessarily use it for subsequent actions. So there are UDP streams or RTP streams that are activated by the web-based HTTP activates a stream delivery which is not over TCP. It may be over a different protocol. And that's all the right thing. I mean, the right thing here is to have protocols that are appropriate to the application that you're looking for. So I'm actually encourage people to take advantage of the fact that the internet is so open to try things out. There's nothing that stops you, theoretically, from building a whole new set of applications. And we see this. Skype is a good example of that, where they simply download an application when you use it instead of anything else that might have been available. So frankly, I'd be happy to see people invent new protocols that do a better job for some things than TCP can do. It's still amazing to me that it's been so robust over this period of time. Yeah. Welcome.
Mr. Cerf,
yes.
I have a question. So how do you think about the privacy? Like Google own our time series search keywords and email data. In the future, this probably can be the most valuable assets of Google. And do you think government will put some legislations to the usage of this data? What's your opinion?
So it's a good question. Well, first of all, we are intensely aware of the importance of preserving privacy, and we've paid dearly for a couple of mistakes that have happened, like the incidental collection of information when we were doing Street View. I think, though, that privacy is becoming increasingly hard to protect. The reason is not because Google has information. We will fight very hard to maintain your privacy. We have resisted government demand for information more actively than many other companies that also hold a lot of information. But we do it to ourselves, and we take pictures with our mobiles, we upload them to a website. Some people are discovered being in places where they weren't even the people you took the pictures of. You took a picture of your friend, but adjacent to your friend is somebody who's now tagged on Facebook or something, and somebody else says, "Oh, Joe was at that party. He said he wasn't there." Now Joe's in trouble because you put a picture up. So the big issue here is learning what our social convention should be to deal with the fact that we have such privacy invasive technology available to us. On the Google side, we do use the data to help figure out how to target ads, and we're very upfront about that. But we don't give the data to anybody else. Some people imagine our business model is to sell data about you to somebody else. That's not what we do. Your data is inside our system and it stays there. You can get all your data back if you want to. But what is important is that we use the information to deliver advertising, which is our business model, and everybody knows that, hoping that that information that gets to you will actually be of interest to you. So the purpose behind the information that we're accumulating is to deliver advertising which is more relevant to you than just blanket ads. And for many people, that kind of advertising is actually, it doesn't even feel like advertising. It feels like useful information. I'm sorry. I can't hear him. Oh, no, can you give him the microphone? Thank you.
In the future, if Google decide to sell those data, do you think government should
I think we would
say, no, you cannot?
Well, let's see, if I were a politician, I would say that's a hypothetical and I don't want to go into it. But it seems to me that the data is so important, and so it would easily be treated as personal data. I mean, it's your email, for example, that we would be in a lot of trouble if we did that. I don't think the company would survive the response. So I'm doubtful. Certainly the current man absolutely would not want to do that. Okay, we have time for just a couple more. This gentleman had his hand. No, next here.
Again, thanks again for the talk. Enjoyable as always. My question actually follows up one from a couple ago regarding the future of sort of internet protocols. I had a question about dynamic mesh networks. Certainly, we have, most of us have mobile phones here, but if the GSM or Wi-Fi goes down, they're kind of useless. And certainly for places where, say Egypt, where the internet, backbone was taken down, or in a crisis situation where the infrastructure isn't available, the phones and most of these devices are not programmed to talk to things that are right next to them. So, from like a pipe standpoint, what would sort of be involved in getting that going?
So I really love the idea. In fact, while I was still chairman of the visiting committee on advanced technology at NIST, we prepared a report on public safety networking, and that was exactly one of the things we pointed out. The current public safety net vector is to use LTE. And when things are normally okay, that's probably all right. But at some point, when you have Katrina or you have Sandy or you have some other kind of event, man-made or otherwise, the infrastructure may not be there at all. And for example, maybe the equipment is there, but you can't get any of the gasoline or the oil or what have you, the diesel fuel, to run the generators. I really love the idea that our devices could be linked together in a mesh-based network. I think that that's how the system I use at home works. It is a mesh network and it's automatically self-forming. I'm a big fan of incorporating that capability into our devices. Now, keep in mind that privacy suggests that we should be encrypting end-to-end in order to take advantage of that. You certainly don't want to use a mesh network in which everybody gets to take a bite of the hot dog, to mix the metaphors, while you're trying to get one at the baseball game. So you really want to be able to use end-to-end capability, but I really like the idea of incorporating that. That would make for a much more resilient system than the one that we have now. So I'm a big fan of that. Okay, maybe two more, and then I really need to go. Who's got the microphone?
So following up on that, it seems that most of our programming languages are actually antiquated. They're geared towards programming a single clock on a single computer, and not on a distributed, not taking advantage of distribution, and that's adds levels of complexity on there. What do you see? I heard of a great language today, Bloom, coming out of Berkeley, or at least experimental language. I'm wondering what else. And I personally am a big fan of Erlang, which is 20 years old. And everybody seems to be trying to catch up to Erlang. So what do you see?
So I actually see a number of things going on. First of all, we have to learn how to program multi-core systems. And that in itself is a challenge. The clock speeds are not going to keep going up. Otherwise, chips will melt because too much power goes into them. So we have to deal with that already. We do that at Google as well. The other thing is that I really like the idea of doing parallel processing. But look at what we've been able to do in a very odd way, where we split some tasks up into multiple parallel streams that doesn't require any special programming to do that. SETI at home and the protein folding activity was simply simple single processor software. It's just that it's being executed simultaneously in a wide number of systems. A lot of our applications are the same way. We take a task and we break it up into large numbers of parallel processes that don't require simultaneous use of cores. Each core is running its own operation. We've been able to get away with that for the kinds of applications that we have. But when we start getting into large-scale simulations, now it gets to be very different, because now you end up having either a single instruction stream running against a whole variety of data, this sort of SIMD, single instruction stream, multiple data stream, or what you're thinking about is MIMD, which is multiple instructions that are distinct running on multiple data streams. There are languages for that, but some of them are really archaic. One of them was called Glipnir, that ran on the ILLIAC-4 back in the 1970s. Nobody could figure out how to program it. It was really hard. Glipnir sounds like something that very few people could even speak. It sounds like a Norse language from the 1000 AD. So I suspect that there is real room for serious software language development. And it's a challenge for ACM and its members to start pushing in that direction. So I'm actually hopeful that the platforms that are going to become available over time are going to force us into thinking of new kinds of programming paradigms. Some of them are a result of higher level languages, which hide some of the underlying complexity of the systems. So maybe you have some ideas to pursue that, but if you don't and others do, I sure hope that you'll make them known to and publish them in CACM so we can all learn from it. One more, and then we really need to break.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on some of the things you were mentioning about intellectual property, and I'm curious about your views on the role and sort of opportunities of the government releasing, more of its own, essentially, IP, because there is this new, I guess, yet another executive order about that came from the White House about releasing open data and sort of the economic potential and all the opportunities around open data. And there's been a lot of activity on that front. And there's a lot more activity around open source in government as well. But it can be kind of mixed. And so I guess just, as an example, I was reading at some of the history of ARPANET, and there was an example of BBN, which I guess was one of the sort of main companies involved, being hesitant to release the source code behind the IMPs, the packet switching computers, and eventually, that turned around and it was open. But I'm curious, sort of, what if you're the government, what are the, how do you find the balance between those opportunities to sort of establish an open platform that people can build economic, capital on top of and other opportunities versus maybe it's something small and you just, it's just a commodity piece of software where it's less important? Like, what do you see of the sort of opportunities and the balance in that equation?
Well, first of all, on openness, I'm a big fan of open access to publications, open access to data, and the government is saying that it wants us to find ways to do that, not just us at ACM, but all the other publishers. I also am a big fan of trying to preserve information. I mentioned that earlier. The digital vellum idea is one of those. I think that increasingly we're going to find people capable of writing their own software. We wouldn't remember when spreadsheets came out way back when in the early 80s. Everybody became programmers of spreadsheets, and they hadn't been formally trained to write software. So don't you imagine that as we work our way up into higher and higher level languages, that more and more people will have the ability either to write their own software or share it with each other. So I think unless we get into this bad loop of preventing people from sharing their software or sharing what their intellectual property, we'll have a higher probability of being able to take advantage of everybody's skills by writing software that's open. That's why I like the open source model so much. I don't know whether that gets to where you were getting at.
That's exactly what I was getting at. I guess maybe as one example, I think there are.
I'm still.
There are some companies that that write software that are largely funded by government, and the software is not open.
And you're saying it's not open.
Right. So.
Well, I can tell you that just to cut this short, because everybody probably wants to get out of here, the government's already spoken, at least at NSF and the White House, OSTP, saying that government-sponsored stuff needs to be accessible. And there are a whole bunch of questions about when is it accessible, how long does it take, do you get to retain the data for a period of time or use on your own. But commercial rights are an argument that shows up when you have government contracts and grants and things of that kind, and that's a negotiated thing. And if the government goes the way it seems to be, I think there's increasing pressure for people who are working under government grant to make available what they've done to the general public. There'll still be an argument over commercial rights. And so this is not a trivial thing to respond to, but certainly the trend right now looks like it's in that direction. Okay, that's all the time we've got, and I need to scoot, but thank you very much again for coming.